In defending itself, Israel must respect international humanitarian law.
Canada has finally officially backed a ceasefire. This vote at the UN. So I'm going to get to the clip and a couple more clips, including reactions to this support for a ceasefire. And I'm also going to discuss what led up to this as well and debunk or just address some of the ridiculous pushback against this support for a ceasefire. So first off, I think this is really where things began to turn. This is back on November 2nd when the third party in line, in case you're not Canadian, the NDP, came out to demand that the Prime Minister calls for a ceasefire. Now, this was because of the pressure that the NDP received. If you go on to see their letter here, they go on to say, over the past 3 weeks, more than 100,000 Canadians have written to us asking Canada to call for a ceasefire. So because of the amount of support for a ceasefire, because of the push from the public, the NDP eventually agreed to do the right thing. They should not have been pushed to this position. It's the humanitarian thing to do. It's the principled thing to do. So the NDP should have already had this position. That said, this shows you the kind of power that people can have when they come together to fight for human rights. So the NDP came out to support that. This was a few days later. I'll just play this in the window. I covered this in a video, but this was crazy.
We need to see a cease. We need to see a humanitarian pause so we can flow. We need to see ceasing of the levels of violence that we're seeing. We need to see civilians protected. We need to see a humanitarian pause.
Came so close to calling for a ceasefire by accident. I think Trudeau knew it was the right thing to do, but because of his partnership, with the U.S. and Israel, it took Trudeau and the rest of the Liberals way too long to get to the right position. But that was on, again, this is the 4th. So a few days later, this poll came out. This is from Main Street Research, and it was commissioned by the National Council of Canadian Muslims, showing that 71% of Canadians support a ceasefire. And there's a few more polls on this, but there's actually not enough polling on this, surprisingly. I tried to look for more recent polling, and I couldn't find anything. But regardless, we saw mass protests in the streets all over Canada in support of a ceasefire. This is in Washington. I cover way too much American politics. This is in Ottawa on November 25th. You see here at 2:15 p.m. So this was one of the mass rallies in support of a ceasefire. And then eventually we got to this point. So this happened just before the vote at the UN. This from CBC News. Canada supports UN resolution calling for ceasefire in Israel-Hamas war, which, God, I can't help myself. It's not a war. One side has a military, the other side does not. It's not a war. Regardless, this is the statement that was released. So worth noting here, it was a joint statement with New Zealand and Australia because, of course, Canada's not going to go out there alone and just say, we support a ceasefire now. They got to find allies around them, which, you could argue is the right thing to do in terms of messaging. You want to show that this is a very normal thing for people that aren't aware. It's a very normal thing to want to see civilians' lives protected. But regardless, they came out here with New Zealand and Australia to support this, saying part of their statement said, quote, from the very beginning, we have said that Israel has the right to defend itself. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly told reporters before the vote on Tuesday, how Israel defends itself matters. Very important to note here, because this is not how you should be defending yourself. So these are, this is the toll over the past 15 years. But of course, more recently, we have seen just the mass atrocities being committed by the far right-wing Israeli government. So all that orange, this is all Palestinians who have died in Gaza because of what the Israeli military is doing to that tiny strip of land and 2.2 million people. But this is the vote. So Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, showing here. I'll put this full screen. So you can see 153 in favor of a ceasefire, 10 against, and 23 abstaining. So obviously I don't know the internal politics of all these countries, but I can wager a guess that a lot of those who have abstained agree with the ceasefire, but because of various relationships they have, either most likely with the U.S., they are unwilling to commit publicly to a ceasefire because they want to maintain those relationships. So they stay, out of it. But and this is normally where you would see Canada. You'd either see Canada siding with the U.S. and Israel, or you would see them abstaining because they don't want to commit to a ceasefire publicly. It's good to see Canada finally, after being pushed by, millions across the country, in finally supporting a ceasefire. Now, here is part of the speech from Bob Rae, the Canadian ambassador at the UN.
In defending itself, Israel must respect international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. The price of defeating Hamas cannot be the continuous suffering of Palestinian civilians.
Obviously, civilians should not suffer because of the actions of those in charge. And that goes for both sides. Israeli civilians should not suffer because of the actions of their far right-wing Israeli government. This is something that was obvious. It's been obvious the entire time. It didn't need to get to this point we're at, I think, around 17,000, 18,000 civilians in Gaza now. So this could have been, if this was a principled position, this would have been taken a long time ago. And this gets to the next clip. So this is the end of the speech where Bob Rae's caught in a hot mic. And listen to what he has to say here.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada. I now give a floor to distinguished representative of Iceland.
See how that flies.
We'll see how that flies, is what Bob Rae says after finishing his little speech there. We'll see how that flies. What this tells me, if anything, is that this, of course, was not a principled position that the Liberals took because they care about human life. No, they took this position because they were losing a lot of support from Muslim Canadians, from young Canadians, and they needed to change course. This is a political move. Because again, if it was a principled move, it would have been taken at the beginning of this. But it's a political move. It's still the right move to make. Don't get me wrong. It's still the right thing to do. But it's just frustrating that you can't have governments simply stand up for human rights. They have to be pushed to the right position by millions of people first. So let's get to the Conservative Party reaction. Here is a bunch of Conservative MPs and their response to Canada supporting a ceasefire.
We are talking about a conflict in which was provoked, initiated, and sustained by Hamas. Hamas is responsible for everything that has happened since October 7th.
This is literally how terrorists justify their actions. Oh, those in charge, their government, the citizens, those civilians, they deserve it because their government did something that hurt us. Their government did the wrong thing, so those civilians deserve it. This is the same argument that Hamas used as well. Hey, the far-right Israeli government has this ongoing occupation, this blockade. Millions of people within Gaza and also in the West Bank are suffering under this military rule by this Israeli government. So these Israeli civilians, they deserve it. How is that any different from what this Conservative MP right here is justifying when it comes to the Israeli government and their indiscriminate bombing of civilians in Gaza? It really is incredible how he doesn't even realize, if he realized what he's spewing here, I don't know, maybe he wouldn't be a conservative. But it's just incredible, the justification that they are making for the mass atrocities that the far right-wing Israeli government is committing. And if you want to just, let's just go in his mind for a second, his world. Just, it's all Hamas. Well, guess who propped up Hamas for years? The Prime Minister of Israel. This is from the Times of Israel. Netanyahu propped up Hamas. And he did this purposely to ensure there would be no Palestinian state. So for years, the various governments led by Netanyahu took an approach that divided power between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, bringing Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to his knees while making moves that propped up the Hamas terror group. The idea was to to prevent Abbas or anyone else in the Palestinian Authority's West Bank government from advancing toward the establishment of a Palestinian state. Netanyahu purposely propped up Hamas to divide Gaza and the West Bank and ensure they would not come together and fight for a Palestinian state. The conservative reaction to this is just completely lacks all historical context, all knowledge, all aware, just lacks any logic. It's completely ridiculous. Now let's get to the NDP reaction to the Liberal move to support a ceasefire.
NDP has been pushing for this from the very beginning. Jagmeet Singh, Heather McPherson, our foreign affairs critic, we've believed it's vitally important to push that Canada's voice needs to push for a release of all hostages, an immediate ceasefire, humanitarian aid going into Gaza. And the NDP is going to continue to push on this. Every day we are up in the House of Commons calling for a ceasefire. We'll continue to do that.
It's good, once again, it is good that the NDP have this position. But for Peter Julian here to pretend, oh, of course, we've always supported a ceasefire. I don't think that's true. I don't think you've always been on the correct side of this issue. You only got to this correct side, again, because you were pushed by people. Public pressure, your voters led you to this position. I think it's important to point that out every time they say to support a ceasefire, that our voters, our supporters pushed us to this correct position and opened our eyes to the realities of what is going on, because otherwise we would not have bothered. So I don't want to seem like I'm just criticizing everyone who's doing the right thing here, because they are doing the right thing. It's to even have the so-called left-wing party in the NDP have to face public pressure to get to a humanitarian position is just incredibly disappointing. They should already be there, regardless of where the public sits. It is the right thing to do, to not only support a ceasefire, but to support an end to the blockade, an end to the occupation, and support a free Palestine. But again, they got to be pushed into the correct position. Comment here as well from, and to be clear, there have been, I'm talking about the party as a whole. There have been members like Nikki Ashton, like Leah Gazan here, who have always been in support of human rights, and they deserve credit for doing so. So Leah Gazan tweeting out, Canada voted for a ceasefire at the UN today because thousands upon thousands of people marched, called their MPs, and spoke out for human rights across the country. The pressure worked. Let's keep up the pressure from an arms embargo and an end to the occupation. Hashtag Free Palestine. So credit here to Leah Gazan and others like her within the NDP who have been fighting for the right thing the entire time. And also credit to them or Leah Gazan here for giving credit to people for pushing Canada to this correct position. Now, Independent Jewish Voices also in support of this, saying IJV welcomes Canada UN's yes vote at the UN General Assembly today, calling for a ceasefire, protection of civilians, release of all hostages, and humanitarian access. While we appreciate this vote, it is more than 60 days too late. And they go on to right here, Canadians in the hundreds of thousands of Independent Jewish Voice members from coast to coast among them have mobilized for months to push the Liberal government to make this call. But this historic movement for peace, justice, and liberation from the Palestinian people mustn't stop here. A ceasefire is only the first step toward what is needed to achieve justice in Palestine, Israel. We must continue to push our government to go further and to take action toward ending Israel's regime of settler colonialism, illegal occupation, and apartheid. Great statement here, and I like that they also point this out. A ceasefire is just one step in a long line of steps that need to get done. So good to see groups like this come out in support of the ceasefire. You have this as well. So the support, or this pointed out by Michael Buchert. I used to know how to say your name, Michael. Now I forget. I believe it's Michael Buchert. Says the demand for a ceasefire is backed by hundreds of civil society and humanitarian groups, 286,000 petitioners. I'll get to that in a second. And weekly protests across the country, up to 100,000. Don't let the media frame Canada's UN vote as divisive just because a handful of pro-war groups object. And this is what he's talking about, at least one of the examples. From the Toronto Sun, a conservative paper here, writing, Liberals should be ashamed after backing UN vote, signaling out Israel. Why should they be ashamed? Of course, it's, because we're hurting our ally in Israel, and we are doing the wrong thing because Hamas are terrorists, and let's ignore all historical context and the reality of what is actually going on there, including this. Let's just completely ignore all of this, there's no need to even read headlines like this except to remind yourself of how insane some people are. But last thing, this is the petition that you should be signing. That was referenced in Michael's tweet as well. So I will link to this below the video. If you are Canadian, you can go and sign this in support of a ceasefire. It breaks down what it's supporting here. So there you go. Really good to see Canada come to the right position, even though they had to be dragged there, kicking and screaming.